Hello, and welcome to Foothold America's U.S. Expansion Mini-Pod, 3 Questions, 1 Voice. I'm your host, Joanne Farquharson, President and CEO of Foothold America. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Christi Jackson, a partner and head of U.S. Immigration with Laura Devine Immigration, which has offices in London and New York. You may recognize Christi from her work as a contributor on BBC News, BBC World Service, Sky News, and CNN, where she shares insights gained from her 20 years of U.S. immigration experience. We'll be discussing the various visa options foreign founders have when expanding their businesses to the U.S. All righty, let's get started with our 3 questions, hearing one voice, Ms. Christi Jackson. Okay, here's our first question. How do you expect the new U.S. administration to affect immigration rules and timelines for business owners seeking U.S. residency?
I think that we've already seen to some extent in the first Trump administration where Trump's priorities lie with regards to immigration. We definitely saw an impact in the first administration. I do have concerns that this new administration, the next 4 years, will be more impactful, perhaps, than the first one. In other words, I think we're going to see more negative changes that will really impact immigration. Now, a lot of what we see on the news is about illegal immigration and undocumented workers. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is that there was in the first administration, and I expect in the upcoming administration, quite a significant impact on legal immigration. And we've heard Trump say things like they just need to come in legally. And the issue we have is that the immigration system is so desperately in need of a massive overhaul. Comprehensive immigration reform has not passed in many, many, many years, and we need changes. And the problem is that the changes that the Trump administration would make would be going the wrong direction. They would make things even harder. So, for example, we know that there's been talk of limiting H-1B visas, which are already so severely limited. They're in a lottery system at the moment, and you're only usually going to be looking at about a 20-25% chance of being selected in the lottery. And so to even limit those further, I think, would be pretty consequential, especially on the tech industry. We do have Elon Musk as an advisor now, so there's maybe some hope that some tech perspective will be put in there. But I think we'll see that lowest level of skills. So the new graduates, the entry level roles are going to perhaps even be almost not available. But as it relates to actual business owners, the visas that we would typically do for businesses expanding to the U.S. would be something like an E2 investor visa or an L1 intracompany transfer visa. We did see some impact on the L1 category in the first administration. Specifically, they did away with a memo that allowed USCIS, which is Citizenship and Immigration Services, allowed them to give deference to previously approved petitions. It meant that filing extensions was predictable. You knew that if you'd been approved once, you should be approved for the extension. They took that away, and that really did have an impact. And then with E2s, we were really impacted with the Buy American, Hire American policy that the Trump administration passed in 2017. Biden quickly revoked it in 2021. Things went back to normal, but we started seeing a real pushback with E2 visas, mainly for employees. For the actual business owners, for their own visas, I don't know that we'll see a massive change. But for a lot of businesses, getting themselves, the owners, the investors to the U.S. isn't quite enough. They need some of their foreign staff.
Yeah.
And that's something I do have some concerns about. I think we'll see something like Buy American, Hire American come back, if not the exact same, the same policy again.
Right. I can understand that. And So the first time around, were you finding far fewer of your clients were successful, or you had to advise them this is unlikely to be successful, or is it just more hoops to jump through or more time?
We were still successful. We really didn't have a massive increase in denials, although um, uh, if you look at the numbers, generally the denial rates did increase quite significantly. H-1Bs went up into the 20% when they're normally in the sort of single digits. And so there were a lot of denials. We didn't really experience them. However, we did experience some significant pushback in our filings. The USCIS-based filings, they issue what's called a request for evidence, where you file a really solid case and they come back and they say, no, we don't like your case. We want more evidence. Even though you've given them 1,000 pages of evidence, it wasn't enough. And so, it was a big fight, a lot more work. I think I saw a report that legal fees went up quite significantly during the Trump administration, and I understand why. There's just so much more work to do under a Trump administration than there has been under a Biden administration, or any other administration for that matter. And so I do expect that the denial rates will increase, hopefully not ours, but the denial rates will increase. Right. I think one of the things that was the most challenging for immigration lawyers was the sort of overnight changes, where we would wake up and there was a new policy, and we would wake up and, you couldn't do something anymore. And that made it really hard to manage client expectations. Which isn't great, when you're meant to know what you're doing. And of course, as a practitioner with 20 years of experience, I do know what I'm doing. But when the goalposts are being moved, overnight, it's really hard. You can feel like you're on the back foot a bit. So I'm anticipating that, so really keeping us on our toes, having to stay really on the ball of what's going on with things, and that makes it really hard to give your clients a good service.
Right. And I'm sure you still gave them a great service, even having to jump through different hoops. But this is really important to be quite upfront and frank about what to expect in 2025 and beyond. So thank you very much. I'm sure you've had the experience with your clients. It's like, okay, bad news is okay, as when you're helping me prep for it and giving me setting my expectations, then that's super helpful. So my next question, Christy, is related to the different types of visas that you work with, and you had given us some background about which ones are going to maybe get a little bit tougher. But do you have, and I'm talking more on the business side of things, do you have a sort of a go-to visa where you go, okay, this one is going to be safe, and if the client fits the bill, then this is where I'd suggest they go? And so any insight you can give into your thinking would be great.
Absolutely, I do. You actually have really hit an important point, which is fits the bill. The way that U.S. immigration works, the way that our visas are set up, is that each visa category has different criteria, and you have to meet those criteria. So a client will come to me with a set of facts, and I will assess those facts to see if they meet the criteria for the visa types that we might be considering. Always, I'm going to be looking, where possible, at an e-visa. The e-visa is it's based on treaties that the United States has with various different countries, lots of different countries. And so it's based on the nationality of the business. So who the ultimate shareholders are. So if a company comes to me and says, oh, we've got 20 shareholders and they're all different nationalities, the e-visa is already off the table, which is unfortunate because it is my favorite visa. But assuming for the time being that the client comes and has pretty straightforward shareholding. They're British. We have a treaty with the UK since the 1800s. We'll start looking at that. And so the E2 visa is an investor visa. The E1 is a trader visa. So for companies that have already been engaged in substantial trade with the US, we might consider an E1 trader. It is based on historical trade. I prefer an E2, mainly because we don't then have to maintain that level of trade, and it gives the company the flexibility to expand their clients to other countries that may not be between just the US-UK trade. So I would normally look at an E2 investor visa. It does require that they make a substantial investment in the US. There is no set figure for.
I bet you get that question all the time. How much? How much do I have to invest?
And I think I'm probably a conservative lawyer, but I like to aim for sort of 100 to 150,000 US. Mm-hmm. I've heard other lawyers, saying, "Oh, it was a $40,000 investment." I struggle for that to be substantial, considering that most cars cost way more than that.
Right.
And I just don't know that that's what I would say is substantial. So I don't feel comfortable with that. I have gone lower than 100 in some cases, especially service-based companies. Sure. Where they go, we don't need anything but a laptop. But that's usually what I'm going to be looking at is if a company is owned by nationals of a treaty country and they are able to make a substantial investment in the US, I'm going to be looking at an E2. If they don't qualify for whatever reason, they're not going to be making an investment, or they don't have the right nationality, we would most likely in that case be looking at the L1 intercompany transfer. But this does depend on the company having operated in the foreign country for at least a year and must continue to operate. So for that sort of single investor just heading off to America and not having any foreign operations, the L1 doesn't work anyway, because we do have to show that the foreign operations continue, that there's sufficient staff to let the foreign operations run without the primary owner.
Okay, so a question about that. That's a very good point. So when people come to us, so for the people operations and hiring in the U.S., they almost always have U.S. sales. And we work, just as you mentioned, with a lot of service companies, SaaS companies. So the developers may be in the home country, and their sales have just grown organically. And now they're talking about getting serious there. So when you say they have to have been sort of established for at least a year, does the trading that they've done count, or do they have to have an entity or employees, or what is it? How is that viewed, that 1 year worth of?
Are you asking about on the L1 intercompany transfer?
Yes.
So there must have been a foreign company that has a corporate relationship with the U.S. company. So parent, subsidiary, affiliate companies. There has to be two separate entities, and they do have to be fully operational. And we would evidence that by things like their tax returns, profit and loss statements, payroll records, contracts with clients, things like that. But talking about trade, if we were looking at an E1, for instance, the treaty trader visa, we would look over a period of a year or more, maybe several years, to show if they have at least 50% of the revenue coming from the U.S. So 50% of their trade is from the U.S. And if that were the case, they may qualify for an E1. Again, though, that has to continue that level of trade. They have to maintain 50% trade with the U.S. So if a big client came in and they were Canadian, it sort of tanks that E1 as an option. So I do try to avoid it where possible. We used to do them for Israel because Israel only had an E1 treaty, but they now have an E2. So for countries that maybe only have an E1, we might consider it. But otherwise, if the country has an E2 treaty, I'm going to be leaning towards an E2.
Gotcha. That's great to know, because I think sometimes people start Googling and they'll go, oh, okay, this seems like a fit. And it's really, for me, hearing you say what your preferences are and why, I find very comforting. So I imagine some founders will as well. So thank you for that. So in your explanation of the different visas, there's a set of facts and there's criteria. What are some of the things that are common amongst multiple visas, where you go, okay, you can expect this, you can expect these things, like an interview or whatever. Can you talk to the process of various visas and how you prepare your clients to go through the process?
Absolutely. So there's really two main ways of getting the visas. One is by first filing a petition at USCIS and waiting for an approval, which you can premium process. And then on approval, scheduling an interview at the US Embassy abroad. Now, that is going to be all of the petition-based visas, like the L1 or the H1B. Those things happen at the USCIS first, then at the embassy for visa issuance.
Okay.
The E2 and for instance, visitor visas happen entirely at the embassy. So nothing goes to USCIS. And so in that situation, you're going to be submitting the application directly to the US Embassy, and it ultimately will end in an interview. Now, in some cases, the interview can be waived. That is newish since COVID. They've continued to try to streamline the process by waiving interviews for certain individuals, but it's not in every case. And so the best practice is just to assume that you'll be attending an interview at the U.S. Embassy. And when you go on to schedule it, it may say after a series of questions, you don't need to come in for an interview. But generally speaking, like for instance, on the E2s, they're all going for interviews. So they will, especially in London, it is varying by consular post, but London is having all E2s come in for an interview.
Okay.
So they should expect that.
That's great. I'm wondering, can you expand a little bit on the interview? I imagine your clients may feel like, oh, that's, it's not just pieces of paper I'm putting in there, but face to face, and I don't want to mess up. Is there a certain prep that you give your clients for the interview?
There is. I think, depending on the visa, I think really the main thing to understand is that they know what they're applying for. So if it's a petition-based case that's already been approved by USCIS, it's a good idea that they've actually looked at that petition and read it and understand what's in it. Know where they're going to be working, know what their job title is going to be, know what their salary is, know what their reporting structure looks like, who are they reporting to, who reports to them. Those are really going to be the sort of the main areas is understanding exactly what they're going to be doing in the U.S. The same is true for the E2, whether this is the E2 investor or subsequent employees who might be obtaining E2 visas based on an approved company registration, is really just understanding what they're doing and being able to articulate clearly what their role is. Now, I think a lot of people think that they go in for these interviews and they're going to be half an hour long, and it's going to be like a job interview where there's a lot of back and forth and they have lots of time to answer the questions and provide their own thoughts and add things and clarify things. And it's just not like that. They're usually only a few minutes long at most. E-visa interviews in London have been taking a little bit longer and have been a little bit tougher in the last sort of 6 months than they have historically been, which is something we are keeping an eye on as a trend. They've been a little bit more difficult, more challenging in London. But generally,
Christy, I'm sorry to interrupt. How would you say, how are they more difficult than they had been?
A lot more questions, a lot more scrutiny than what we have previously been used to. We've been seeing it specifically in London, seeing a little bit more scrutiny, a lot more questions, higher rates of denials especially for the employees, a lot of questions that in some cases don't actually apply or shouldn't be asked because they're not relevant. Things like about the salary, we're having some issues there. So these are just things that we're kind of keeping an eye on as immigration lawyers. We're keeping an eye on what's going on at the embassy in London. But generally speaking, interviews are 3 or 4 minutes long, and they're relatively predictable in that they are going to be talking about the role, the company, what does the company do, where's the company based, how many employees are there, what is your role, how long have you worked for the company, how many people do you have reporting to you, who do you report to, all kinds of questions that should be in the documentation that's been submitted, and the person should be familiar with it. And if an employee turns up for an E2 manager visa and can't answer where they're supposed to work or what their job title is, I wouldn't be surprised that they would be denied because it doesn't look like a very legitimate application. So it's just really about being prepared, I think, is probably the overall. I do see for the investors themselves who've done their own E2s, they do come to me afterwards because they haven't gone well. And it's usually because they just don't appreciate that, like, the application can't just be 5 pages, tick box, tick box, tick box. It's voluminous. You've got to provide evidence. Everything must be supported with evidence. And a lot of people don't realize that. Investors also don't realize they actually need to spend the money before in order for it to count as investment. I get a lot of
just having it in the bank account doesn't.
I get a lot of clients coming to me with denials, and they say, we had $150,000. We heard that that's how much we had to have, so we put it in a U.S. account, but that doesn't work because the investment must be at risk. It needs to be spent. So we fix that and then refile, and they're usually fine after that.
That's great. Speaking as someone who has had multiple visas in different countries, I started off with that probably American arrogance where I was like, of course I can do this. I can read, I can, blah, blah, blah. And all it takes is messing up one visa and I will never, ever do it again. It's just, it makes so much sense to have the right experience behind you. And you're so tuned into what's going on at the embassies and with regulations that you're just going to see things that are the latest. So
that's right.
So yeah, that's definitely important. And so thank you for answering those 3 questions. They were really, really, really good answers. And I think you touched on some things that people want to know before they start picking up the phone and talking with immigration attorneys. So we have a bonus question for this season, and it's less about you as the attorney, but more about you as the employee, because you've worked in both the U.S. and the UK multiple times. So can you share with us some of the things that are different culturally, work culture-wise, either based in the countries where you've been, because our viewers are going to be, or our listeners are going to be expanding into the U.S. and are going to be dealing with employees for the first time. So can you give us some insight about what it's like to be a U.S. employee or a UK employee?
Sure. I mean, I think, this is going to depend largely on the actual company. I think that company culture can vary widely, even within different countries. So in other words, 2 companies in the US could have vastly different cultures, and 2 companies in the UK could have vastly different cultures. And so I think that's really important to understand, is that, especially as a business owner, is that you create a culture that aligns with, what it is that you're after. I think generally speaking, probably the biggest differences are going to be some of the more legal differences. Things like holiday time, being mandated in Europe versus not required at all in the U.S. Maternity leave being, a year in the U.K. and not at all in the U.S. And I do think that if going from the UK to the US, especially for an employee, they're going to expect that they're, perhaps going to be afforded some of those benefits that they're used to from the UK. And I think you won't that wouldn't be the norm in the U.S. Obviously, vacation time is not very much in the U.S.
Right.
So those are things that I would say. I think compensation, depending on, again, where you are, what industry you're in, is going to vary. For instance, I think, and industry is huge on this, but I do think that salaries generally are lower in the UK than in the US, pretty much anywhere. So that's something I think that is a little bit of an eye opener. And as far as work-life balance is concerned, which is what is always a hot topic for everyone. Again, I think this is company culture, isn't it? So, I've worked in both places and in different companies that have all different, very, very different views on this. And I think generally speaking, work-life balance is probably better in the UK and in Europe. Again, industry specific, but I think generally speaking, there is a bit of more of a focus on work-life balance in the UK than in the US. I don't know that. I think that's a good thing, but for someone going to the US, that's not going to be great for them.
Right.
But again, I think that any company can establish their own parameters about what's important to them.
Right. Very good point, because there is the culture, and you've tapped into some of the not necessarily stereotypes, but the things people sort of are aware of, like, oh, you don't get much leave. And we've tried at Foothold America to meld the two. So bringing the salaries up in the UK, expanding the amount of leave in the US. And it was really hard for us, for the American employees working in the US to take the leave. We'd come up on the end of the year and we're going, hey, you've got 5 weeks of leave here. And they're like, I don't know what to do with it. So it does take a while, but I think you're absolutely right. It's the culture of the organization. And that ends up being something that's quite important for our clients that are based in the UK or elsewhere, is to try and bring that over there. So I think what you're saying is, if you're a US employee and you're considering working for a company based elsewhere, you can't really make assumptions. It's going to be about the culture of that company, and it could be very similar to the US or have a very European feel to it.
And vice versa. Absolutely. I think that's important to keep in mind. I think culturally, as far as just day-to-day interactions, I think that there is a cultural difference. Obviously I'm American, I live in the UK. There is a cultural difference. And I think, some people really adapt and are able to sort of fit in with a different culture. And some people will really struggle. I think it's just being aware that even though we speak the same language between the US and the UK, there is a lot of, cultural differences, generally speaking, even just in language. So I think just being aware and perceptive, I think anyone can thrive in either place.
Great. Thank you for joining us for this insightful episode featuring Christi Jackson, partner and head of U.S. Immigration with Laura Devine Immigration. And thank you, Christy, for sharing your expertise guiding foreign corporations and individuals through their U.S. expansion journeys. If you enjoyed today's conversation, subscribe to U.S. Expansion Mini-Pod on your favorite platform. Published on the first and third Wednesdays of every month, you'll find engaging U.S. expansion discussions with industry leaders and innovators. Don't forget to share this episode with your network and leave us a review. We love hearing your feedback. For more information about Christi Jackson and her work at Laura Devine Immigration, you'll find her contact information in the comments. This has been Joanne Farquharson, President and CEO of Foothold America, and that wraps up our 3 questions for today. Until next time, keep expanding your horizons.